Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you all to the second of the two webinars we're holding today. We have just done one specifically on China, and while we're looking at China a bit again in the second one, we're working as part of our Defence, Security and Resilience series in a forum entitled Addressing Urgent Issues for the UK, the US and their allies, Effecting the Grey Zone Against China and Other Competitors. We have a remarkable panel, and we shall be chaired by Madeleine Moon, who, when she was in active politics in the Defence Select Committee and as chairman of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, gave us a lot of guidance and support, and in the last several years has helped us a lot with the development of our projects. We're particularly pleased to have her in the chair. Stephen Kinnock MP is joining us as the British political contributor today, and we're delighted to welcome him. Congressman James Langevin, who has keynoted for us before, is coming back. He's down to deliver the opening speech, but he can't get to us for another half hour, so his opening speech will come at the end of the presentations in the panel session, but we're very much looking forward to having him. Then we're delighted to be working again with George Barnes, the Deputy Director of the NSA, who's one of the favourites of Cityforum. We have, with the NSA, developed ideas and concepts for discussions over the last 12, 13 years, and they've always been remarkably interesting, and George has been keen to see the maximum amount of discussion with the fewest controls over inputs. Miriam Howe of BAE Systems is to speak alongside George. She is representing BAE Systems Applied Intelligence. This afternoon is a cyber expert. We carry on with a big concentration on cyber in this series, and look forward to her role today. As I said at the beginning of the afternoon, BAE Systems have represented a really excellent sponsor for us in that they're helpful. We operate this project on a very limited budget. We're much helped by BAE Systems in finding the budget, and BAE is constructive and helpful in a way that I find remarkable after nearly 50 years in this business, since I started the FD's business information activities in 1971. We're very grateful to BAE Systems, and we're delighted to have you with us, Miriam. We're also very pleased this afternoon to have Lieutenant General Richard Nugee taking part, because we're going well beyond cyber, and Rebecca Nadin of the Overseas Development Institute, she is speaking too. We have a really fine group of speakers. Madeleine, who runs our occasions very well, will guide us. I'm sure there will be questions that are of very great interest. NSA has helped us with ideas for the program. The Ministry of Defence has helped us with ideas for this program. We work closely with DCDC in Shrivenham in arranging the thoughts that go into these agendas. We look forward to a second discussion, and if we have it with the quality that the first one had, it will be remarkable. We shall think it a good afternoon's work. Madeleine, thank you for helping us, and over to you.
Madeleine, can I ask you to unmute yourself, please?
Sorry. We're going to start off with a minor crisis, because Stephen Kinnock has been called away to vote. So he's going to be missing for about 20 minutes. So George, just to warn you, I'll be coming to you first, and we'll move through the speaking order until we get Stephen back. And hopefully there won't be a string of votes in Westminster. So welcome and hello to our audience. During the webinar, as you know, only the speakers will be visible. But after each of the speakers have given their presentation, we will go straight into a discussion where you'll be able to participate and I'm very keen that as many of you as possible place questions and comment in the chat box so that we can have a lively discussion in the second part of this second session. I will attempt to get as many people engaged in that as possible. The second session will be under Chatham House rule, but this first session is open. So let's go straight to hear from our speakers, because they've got much more interesting things to say than myself. So we'll go first of all to Mr. George Barnes, the Deputy Director of the NCA, who's going to look at the challenges in the cyber domain. Are we focusing on them? Oh, sorry, are we facing up to them? Sorry, George, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to be back. I only wish I was in London. I miss it dearly, and COVID has complicated my annual visits. But that being said, this is an interesting time. The focus today has been predominantly on China, but there's an elephant in the room. And I think that elephant might be closer in our midst. The name is Russia. And I just thought I would do some framing comments because looking at how we're trying to deal with the Russian situation is illustrative with respect to what China might be in the future. And so I think we're learning along the way. And when it comes to considering the gray zone, a lot of what we're confronting on the Russian front puts us squarely there. So let me start my comments by reading a 15 January post by Microsoft's Threat Intelligence Center, or MISTIC. MISTIC has identified evidence of a destructive malware operation targeting multiple organizations in Ukraine. This malware first appeared on victim systems in Ukraine on 13 January. Microsoft is aware of the ongoing geopolitical events in Ukraine and the surrounding region, and encourages organizations to use information in this post to proactively protect from any malicious activity. The post goes on to say, MISTIC assesses that the malware, which is designed to look like ransomware, but lacking a ransom recovery mechanism, is intended to be destructive and designed to render targeted devices inoperable rather than to obtain a ransom. While the focus of today's session is facing up to China, events current and prospective in Russia are bringing focus to our cyber domain awareness and challenges. While these malicious activities against Ukraine have yet to be directly attributed to Russia, they are indicative of what we can and should expect as we look to a future where cyber activities will pervade all stages of nation-state maneuvering. This is life in the gray zone, through and through. While I would characterize this recent activity as psychological softening, what else awaits Ukraine, or us, over the course of the coming weeks and months? Will Russia use more influence operations to shake the confidence of the Ukraine government and populace? Will it use disinformation to falsely portray a Ukrainian or Western threat as a pretext for offensive action? Will it attack Ukraine's critical infrastructure as part of its campaign? Will it use cyber to threaten us or our interest in response to punitive measures we may take in response to a Russian incursion? How should we prepare? How do we deal with non-attributable activities that align with the choreography of a nation-state agenda? What response measures should we consider in the event Russia uses offensive cyber against Ukraine? How about operations against us or our key allies? Cyber operations in all their various forms are soundly established within Russia's strategy for global engagement. Recall Estonia in 2007, Georgia in 2008, the 2018 Winter Olympics in South Korea, interference in numerous democratic elections, including ours, the SolarWinds exploitation operations in 2020, harboring myriad ransomware syndicates that threaten every corner of our societies. The list goes on. Interestingly, the Russian government arrested the REvil ransomware kingpin on or about the same day that the unexplained malicious cyber events lit off in Ukraine. Coincidence? I doubt it. Well, I'm using the current situation in Russia as the backdrop for my comments. We could roll fast forward a number of years and be considering a similar China-Taiwan situation. And I'm sure China is watching the Ukraine developments very closely, perhaps most especially the US response. Moreover, as we are well aware, China uses cyber for all aspects of its global dominance agenda. and the rapidity by which its hackers exploit vulnerabilities discovered in Western software is just plain scary. So are we facing up to the challenges in the cyber domain? It feels as though they will always outpace us. Autocratic governments like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are and will continue to execute malicious cyber operations in a manner contrary to established international norms. This is our reality. So we must continue our pursuit of defensive resilience while undertaking measures to increase the cost and consequences of malicious behavior. Along these lines, and in line with the defense, security, and resilience theme of the day, there are 4 categories of ongoing focus or pursuit I'd like to highlight. First, we need to make cyber penetration harder through enhanced defense mechanisms. Second, we need to impose costs on malicious cyber actors and their host governments through disclosure and accountability. Third, we need to leverage industry's growing capabilities, per my opening example. And fourth, and to the point that Mr. Inglis made earlier, we need to create timely value through bidirectional sharing between governments and industry. While I don't have time during these introductory comments, perhaps we'll be able to expand on these focus areas during today's discussion, as we have a growing number of illuminating examples for each one. So turning back to the key question of our report card, I think we're trending toward a C+. I think we'd all agree that we have a long way to go. Worse yet, the scale of impacts continue to mount. And autocratic nation states are maintaining and mainstreaming the use of cyber to exert influence, create societal discord, steal intellectual property and money, and project their power. That said, I feel as though we're turning a corner. New things have started to happen, and I see the rate of change of our successes increasing year on year. And notably, I'm glad and proud that the UCUSA relationship continues to lead the way for cybersecurity among democratic nations. Thank you, and I'll turn it back to you, Madeleine.
Thank you, George. Well, that's certainly a stunning start to the presentations. I want to move on now to Miriam Howe, the Senior Security Consultant with BAE Systems, who's going to talk to us about digital defense in depth, what this means in the 21st century threat environment, which is just right to follow you, George. Miriam.
Thanks, Madeleine. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for having me to speak. So my career started out in enterprise security, which is helping organisations to secure their own networks and assets. So defence in depth, which is the topic of this note, is a very familiar concept to me. In traditional enterprise security, defence in depth is multiple layers of countermeasures so that if one fails, an attacker doesn't get straight in. And the analogy we always used in the physical world was a castle. So it's on a hill, it's got a moat around it, a drawbridge, staircases, locked doors, armed guards. It's not just about stopping an attacker, it's about slowing them down and making it harder. So talk a little bit about what this looks like nowadays, and we could talk about this for 3 days. But one example of how things have changed is the move to the cloud, for example, which renders meaningless some of our traditional perimeter security controls. So we no longer assume that 2 systems that want to talk to each other are from, are trusted and are speaking via a trusted tunnel. So we have to assume zero trusts, and we introduce more controls in to compensate for that. And that's a change related to how we started constructing our infrastructure. And I think there are some other countermeasures that are more prominent today in today's world, and that one of them relates to the resilience of people to cyber attacks. So the study of human factors has evolved quite a lot in recent years. It's no longer about blaming the user for bad practices. It's about recognizing that humans and systems are mutually dependent, and you might target the user to get to the system, or you might target the system to get to the user. And although targeting users is certainly not new, the understanding of human factors has really come on recently in terms of understanding human vulnerabilities to subversion, distraction, stress, particularly under certain conditions. And of course, with that understanding, we're better able to protect the users from making the wrong decision or from targeted subversions or deception attacks. And in turn, we can protect the system from the user. And we've certainly seen that changing threats in both in mass phishing attacks and in the certainly more targeted cyber operations of today. So defence in depth is still very much a core principle of enterprise security, but the castle analogy also helps to illustrate a difference between enterprise and national security challenges. So securing an enterprise is a bit like securing the fort. Organisations have to manage the security within meaningful boundaries, as we talked about. It's organisations' data, it's their own people, their infrastructure. Whereas cybersecurity at a national level is quite a different prospect, because a nation that's full of enterprises that have managed to secure their own networks and applied their patches, etc., that would be a great thing to achieve. But it doesn't actually add up to national cybersecurity. There's a gap between what we can expect from enterprises, i.e. to protect itself and its consumers, and what we need to protect a nation in cyberspace, which is about the mid-space. It's about legislation, about organisations. So at a national level, it's very much about breadth as well as defence in depth. And this does highlight the need for the central coordinating model across different organisations. And in the UK, that's been implemented with the NCSC at the heart of national cyber defence. But at the same time, a strong message in both the integrated view and the national cyber strategy at the end of last year is the integration of cyber objectives, both domestic and overseas, to be distributed across government. And we do see those agendas disseminated across NCSC, DCMS, National Cyber Force and the Foreign Office, with every government department needing to engage on the cyber issues that relate to its own work, which will almost certainly overlap with the interests of other departments. And that sort of strategic coherence, I think there's definitely the impression that other nations have been very good at explaining how different strands of activity link up into strategic objectives. And I think that's something that the integrated operating concept of 2020 and the integrated view of 2021 seek to counterbalance. And we kind of see that in the alignment, of other nations like China in terms of the foreign investment in technical infrastructure overseas and the influence that has on technology development, both with that technical investment and multilateral organisations. But that brings me back to the point that national cyber defence isn't really just about government, it's about the role for industry as well. And we can look at a number of different sectors and see the specific roles that they have in national cyber defence. So taking the telco sector, which handles the communications of citizens and businesses, and increasingly that's passing to big tech. But there's responsibilities there for counterterrorism and law enforcement, and indeed a critical role in cyber threat detection across public networks, which and indeed the potential actions that can be taken in response to cyber threats. So, for example, protective DNS and website takedowns. So there is that responsibility within the telco sector for national cyber defence. If we look at a completely different sector, the finance sector, it's very likely that soft power is concentrated in the economy, stock exchanges, central banks, and critical businesses, and they attract a greater threat because they're seen as that sort of concentration of soft power, particularly in countries which serve as financial hubs with influence beyond its borders. And that influence is underpinned by trust, which means that we need operational resilience in those foundations of the economy, in the payment systems and in the clearance systems. So I talked about the difference between national cybersecurity and enterprise cybersecurity. And I think that we all need to recognise that threat is much broader. It's not just about the crown jewels. The attack surface is much broader. And we've seen that with, for example, the supply chain attacks of recent years. And I'll just touch on partnerships and alliances then. So alliances have always been important in defence, and one of the principles of national cyber defence is international collaboration. So we can if we just take a really tactical military scenario, we could see a situation in which, let's say, some malware has been detected on a deployed military platform, but some crucial insights, the TTPs of the attacker, for example, may be provided by a cyber agency from another country. And we can liken those investigations or an instant response to a jigsaw where different countries have different parts of the picture, and it's only when you piece them all together that you have the complete picture. And we need that collaboration, not just instant response, but in preparation. We need to be doing joint exercising. Really, you can see this a lot with things like the NATO CCDOE exercises, where you have nations that are teaming up together and sat next to each other and really sharing expertise and skill sets. And we can see this in foreign policy as well as in military, building partnerships and alliances. There's a lot of, if taking for example the Indo-Pacific, we've seen a recent agreement signed with our Australian counterparts feels like a firm step for collaborating in the region, as well as other frameworks like ASEAN and CPTPP, into which digital economy and cybersecurity may enter the dialogue as part of the legitimate discussion. So those building that cooperative cyber policies with allies may mean sharing expertise on those technologies that we've invested in, which gives breadth and depth through our alliances. So just to wrap up then, just to conclude or summarize, so defense in depth, it's definitely still current for enterprises. It changes with how we can construct our infrastructure and in line with the threat environment, which is obviously growing in terms of both horsepower and sophistication. National cybersecurity, on the other hand, requires depth and breadth as well as depth across all parts of government and industry. And each of those parts need to recognise their roles, which is both defensive and proactive, if we're going to have that strategic coherence. And international partnerships and alliances are, as ever, an important part of defence, even when it's more proactively about shaping technology and standards, as we've been talking about in the previous session, and building partnerships with like-minded allies where we can collaborate and share our expertise towards our respective defence in depth.
Thank you, Miriam. That was excellent. There's lots of things in. I've been scribbling away here. Thank you very much. We're going to move on now to Dr. Rebecca Nadin, the Director of Global Risk and Resilience in the Overseas Development Institute. Rebecca, you're going to look at disasters, disruption and migration. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for welcoming me here today. I'm, as Madeleine says, I'm from the Overseas Development Institute, where I head up the Global Risks and Resilience team there, but also spent many years in China working on a range of issues. And so today's topic, the webinar around facing up to China, but I want to talk a little bit more about how we need to face up to the 21st century risk landscape that we face. And within that, I'll be touching on issues of disaster and migration disruptions. But first and foremost, I'd just like to start by saying, I think we need to think a little bit differently about how we understand risks and the trade-offs of decisions, and thus building the resilience to them. And this is because emerging threats, such as severe environmental degradation, and within that I include climate change, but also COVID, antibiotic resistance, economic and financial instability, conflict, transnational criminal and terrorism networks, cyber disinformation and threats that we've heard about, as well as geopolitical volatility, of all the potential, as we know, to completely alter socioeconomic, environmental and political systems. But many of these global threats are not new, and nor are their impacts so unpredictable. I think many of us may now watch Bill Gates's TED Talk in 2015, explaining why we were not ready for the next pandemic with chills. But that's not just, it's not just about confronting these threats, it's about understanding how they materialize and how they metastasize. And that's because these global threats share common characteristics. And I think we sometimes struggle to get our head around that. And that's because these threats, they're interconnected, they're crossing borders, they're transformational because they're shifting socioeconomic, technological and environmental systems, as I said, with that potential to radically change our societies and alter the status quo that we've all sort of become accustomed to. So they are creating an inherently different 21st century risk landscape, which is highly complex. And it's this risk landscape which I think is increasingly leaving us blindsided, not only by the immediate impacts resulting from these threats themselves, but most importantly, by the cascading impacts of how these threats intersect. So all too often, we're still looking at these threats in silo. So perhaps justifiably, because it's so complex, actually we struggle to wrap our heads around the enormity of this. So often we say we live in unprecedented times, but perhaps what we really mean is that we're not really allowing ourselves to fully grasp the nature and complexities. So this results in our risk management mindset whether it be at the global or national scale, to remain very siloed. So to sort of coin a phrase, we need much better situational awareness of the nature of these global threats and the holistic understanding of how they might be changing our operating context or our human systems. I think it was Henry Paulson said, the fact that we're not ready for a very predictable pandemic should be a wake-up call to all of us. Mm-hmm. He argued that the leading economies of the G20 must be confronting risks across a much broader range of threats. And that is happening, but again, it still tends to be happening in silo. And that's because traditional approaches often force us to look at one threat at a time, and they're not addressing the multiple connected and simultaneous threats. So we need a much more systems thinking approach rather than clinging to sort of linear analysis and response, because that is not constituting risk management. I mean, COVID-19, a very clear example, starts as a public health crisis, but then spreads to all aspects of the human system, creating obvious and then sometimes not so obvious consequences. So, for example, much focus on the economic impacts of COVID, the public health aspect, but not so much focus on what emerge around transnational criminal networks, switching or intensifying their areas of revenue. For example, due to supply chain issues in COVID operating environment, the price of cocaine tripled in the UK, and COVID scams became rife, from phishing emails to companies selling fake products. So there we've got the intersection with the cybersecurity world. So, if countries like the UK are to play a role in building resilience, then we need to actually also acknowledge head on that there will be trade-offs and transitions. Not everyone will benefit equally at the same time. So, for example, with climate change, the intensity and frequency of extreme weather events is going to place increasing demands on humanitarian and disaster risk response mechanisms. So there's going to have to be some difficult decisions about where those response resources are going to be. We also need to start, I think, framing from the starting point an innate acknowledgement that it's also our framing and then subsequent responses to these threats that are also generating positive and negative feedback. And this is because, again, if we just take things in silo, we're not thinking about the trade-offs. So for example, from some of the work that ODI has been doing in Myanmar, we were looking at climate-related REDD+ policies aimed at reducing climate change and protecting the forest. But actually, some of these policies themselves were exacerbating tensions through the failure to account for the socio-economic inequalities. And this was actually increasing conflict risk, and at the same time not actually meeting the climate objectives. Also, the current framing of narratives around human mobility and the role of climate change. So this often takes quite a reductionist approach and can sometimes miss the point that people are on the move for many reasons. Yes, climate change will definitely be altering the frequency, the intensity, the duration of sudden and slow onset climate events. But we did quite a bit of research looking at events in 2016, for example. So we saw that over 24 million people were displaced by sudden onset climate hazards and typhoons and floods, for example. But they were displaced internally within the country. So they weren't actually migrating overseas. They were displaced internally and they were returning to their homes within relatively short periods of time. So whilst also there's strong evidence, for example, that adaptations to climate shocks can reduce, again, issues such as migration. However, if we're not careful, those very measures can also contribute to displacement, migration and conflict, as we saw in the case of Myanmar. So when we're framing the problem and framing our response measures to climate issues, we need to, for example, in the case of migration and conflict, we need to really have at the heart of it that it's often the underlying structural issues related to the political and socioeconomic inequality in governance and histories of conflict that create the fragility. So again, these problems that are not new, they've always been there, the underlying vulnerabilities, because if we don't, we're not able to build climate resilience. So in response to a 21st century risk landscape, building resilience, absolutely, we need to be accounting for multiple threats, the complex risk interactions. So for example, we talk a lot about low carbon transition risk, but how do we really understand how we've got issues around tech critical supply minerals, obviously the role of China wanting to own that kind of new industrial renewable revolution, and so on. We need to think more about stress testing and programming. So agencies such as development agencies, MODs, foreign offices, etc., really thinking about the policies that are being put out there, and to understand how these interventions can, first of all, withstand some of the shocks, but then also how they can avoid negative feedback loops without creating trade-offs. But all of this requires great and comprehensive cross-government working. It requires financial and human resources and are willing to take risks, not something governments are traditionally willing to do. So perhaps one of the greatest concerns for me in this sort of post-COVID world, as we start to emerge out of lockdowns, hopefully, is that actually we will keep with these traditional approaches, these siloed approaches to risk governments, clinging helplessly to sort of linear analysis that really fails to understand how threats intersect. And whilst at the same time failing to grapple with these unintended consequences of our responses to manage one set of threats, and then ignoring the need to tackle others. So I guess my call is for a bit of a paradigm shift that needs to happen, not just within agencies that are typically quite good at understanding these issues, such as military MODs, etc., but for that to be a much better understanding of the landscape that we're facing across much broader audiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. It sounds to me like you're not just calling for government to look at silo mentalities, but also to talk about a greater understanding with the public of the complexity of the issues and the potential risks of the responses that we're taking. It's a much more nuanced conversation with the public so that they also are less vulnerable to disinformation and alienation as a result of whatever social media is saying this is what's happening.
Exactly, yeah, much more sort of honest, and I think we might just have to be a bit more upfront as to what some of those risks are going to mean for people. Yeah.
Well, I think we'll all look forward to seeing that happen. Okay, Stephen, are you with us for a while?
I am indeed. Those were the final votes for today, so we're in the clear.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Then we'll come to you, Stephen, knowing that you're with us and you're going to stay, and you're going to give us the UK risk assessment, and perhaps tell us whether or not it is going to be possible, as Miriam suggested, that we have a little bit more honest and open examination of the complexity of some of the threats that we're facing. So, Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Madeleine, and many thanks to Cityforum for this invitation. It's a real honour to be alongside such an outstanding panel of speakers, and very much looking forward to the discussions afterwards. Well, I've been asked to talk about UK Labour's position, really, in terms of grey zone activity, and with a particular focus on China. I'm currently the Shadow Minister for the Armed Forces in our Shadow Defence team, but previous I was in the Shadow Foreign Office team and with the Asia brief, so was working very closely on our China policy and strategy. So I'm going to try in 7 minutes to canter through the issues as we see them from the Shadow Defence team and our Shadow Front Bench, and also to say a little bit about what we think needs to happen to make ourselves more resilient in the face of an increasingly aggressive and belligerent China. This issue of the grey zone, it cuts across the whole landscape really in terms of national security, from the information and propaganda flows to the battle for political influence and leverage, all the way through to real military risks and threats, including what we're seeing in Taiwan, the South China Sea, and Ladakh, and then of course cyber security, which many colleagues have spoken about already today. Our starting point is that we see President Xi, or China, since 2013 really, and since President Xi ascended to power, as changing completely in terms of the much heavier focus on becoming a systemic competitor and rival to democracy around the world, to increasing the cultural and linguistic dominance of the Han Chinese in China, and to repudiating China's so-called century of humiliation. We look at things like document number 9, published in 2013, which in essence forbids party members to support Western constitutional democracy, forbids them from supporting the notion of universal values, civil society or Western journalism, and leaves no doubt at all about the supremacy of the CCP's ideology. So this brand is increasingly being promoted across the world, and two main vehicles for that are the Belt and Road Initiative across the developing world, and the United Front Work Department in terms of influence in Western democracies. So with that in mind, where are we seeing the pinch points? Well, clearly a huge amount of saber rattling going on over Taiwan. In 2020, China buzzed Taiwanese airspace over 300 times, and then 78 times on the 1st and 2nd of October 2021, and in each case with highly sophisticated military aircraft. We've seen aggressive steps in the South China Sea. The vaguely defined 9-dash line is clearly an incursion and against the international law of the sea. There's the process of building artificial reefs and militarizing them. We're seeing the increasingly aggressive behavior of the People's Liberation Army across the South China Sea and also on the Indian-China border. In terms of cyber attacks, state-sponsored hacking reached record levels in September 2021. In July 21, the US, the EU, NATO, and 4 other countries all accused Beijing of being behind a massive exploitation of vulnerabilities in Microsoft's widely used Exchange company server. So we're seeing a ramping up of aggression across various theaters of engagement. In terms of the more the battle for hearts and minds, if you like, and the competing narratives, we're seeing increasing crushing of freedom of speech. The UK Parliament's Foreign Affairs Select Committee, in its report entitled China and the Rules-Based International System, found alarming evidence of Chinese interference in UK university campuses. We've seen the sanctioning of British members of Parliament, both the House of Lords and the House of Commons and others, simply for doing their jobs and speaking out against the atrocities that are being perpetrated against the Uyghur people in Xinjiang. We're seeing pro-Beijing activists here in the UK targeting people like Nathan Law, who has been campaigning for democracy and freedom in Hong Kong. And we've seen many, many other examples of this crushing of free speech. We're seeing security threats, intellectual property theft. Civitas think tank has accused 14 of the UK's top 24 universities of having ties with Chinese weapons conglomerates and military-linked research centres, and many other examples of British academics either knowingly or unwittingly helping the Chinese government in terms of development of military capability. The other key concern is around the acquisition of British economic assets and critical national infrastructure. China currently holds a 33% stake in Hinkley Point nuclear power station, a 10% stake in Heathrow Airport, and a 9% stake in Thames Water. It's become the largest crude oil operator in the North Sea. In 2012, the chairman of the China National Offshore Corporation, Drilling Corporation, declared that, and I quote, "large-scale deepwater rigs are our mobile national territory and a strategic weapon." So what do we do about this? Our view is that consecutive conservative governments since 2010 have been profoundly naive and complacent in their dealings with the Chinese state and Chinese Communist Party. We've left the British economy wide open, over-reliant on supply chains originating in China, and allowed our critical national infrastructure to be put up for sale in a completely unstrategic manner that has not taken account of national security concerns. So we need to see a fundamental reset in UK-China relations. We believe it should be based on three key pillars: compete, challenge, and cooperate. Competing, particularly in the field of technology, we think there should be a pooling of resources with our democratic allies to really come together on things like cyber, on quantum computing, on artificial intelligence, in order to have the scale that's required to be able to compete with the vast investment in research and development that we see from Beijing. We have to be ready to challenge on human rights, challenge to protect the international rules-based order, and that requires consistency and strength together. And we do have to be able to cooperate as well, and particularly on issues such as climate change and pandemics. And we believe that we need, in fact, some believe that those three pillars are mutually exclusive. We actually believe that the three are mutually reinforcing, because the Chinese regime respects strength and consistency and unity, and is completely contemptuous of weakness and division. So by holding firmly together in each of these pillars of the strategy, we actually believe that they will reinforce each other. We need to rebuild our strategic resilience by reducing our dependence on China. We need to have a fundamental audit of every aspect of the UK-China relationship, including business, the law, government, academia, so that those engaging are doing so with their eyes wide open. And we need to have an alliance-based foreign policy. I deeply regret the fact that I would say the last 5 or 6 years, our government has been dedicated to burning bridges, destroying alliances with our democratic partners and allies, and that leaves us wide open in terms of the exploitation by authoritarian regimes of the weakening alliances and the ties that have bound us together for decades. So all of that needs to change, and it needs to change urgently. We support the AUKUS initiative, but we feel that it was done in a way that ended up alienating France, which was both unnecessary and clumsy, and to be regretted. We need to stand shoulder to shoulder around the issue of Taiwan and make it absolutely clear that there are red lines there that must not be crossed. We need to be bolder on sanctions. There are senior officials such as Chen Quanguo, who is the architect of the atrocities in Xinjiang, who has not been subjected to Magnitsky sanctions, in spite of the fact that we've had a number of UK parliamentarians sanctioned by the Chinese regime. We need a full registration of foreign agents based on the US model. We have armies of lawyers here in London in particular who are acting for oligarchs from a variety of regimes and doing their dirty work. That needs to stop. We need to rebuild the British aid program so that it, along with other allies, can become a credible competitor with the Belt and Road Initiative. And we really need to pool our resources around creating the kind of scale that will enable us to compete across the whole waterfront of technology challenges that we face, and particularly where those challenges relate to our national security. We need to have a very clear statement from the UK government that it will be conducting a diplomatic and political boycott of the Beijing Winter Olympics, where it would be completely wrong, in our opinion, to be sending members of our royal family and government to rub shoulders with a regime that is conducting atrocities against its own people. So we need to see the UK government stepping up. We feel that there's a real division between some parts of government which are becoming stronger and more robust on China, and some which are still stuck in the utterly failed golden era that we saw under David Cameron and George Osborne. We need to wake up, recognize that that golden era is over, and we need to be far more realistic and robust in our policies. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope I've helped to lay out where the British Labour Party stands on these issues, and very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you, Madeleine.
Thank you, Steve. That's an interesting one, calling for a sort of a clear definition of what's non-sensitive, what's non-strategic areas where we can cooperate with China, as opposed to a realistic appraisal of areas where we need to be working closer with allies and with industry to build new forms of cooperation. Thank you, Stephen. Right, so we'll move on now to General Richard Nugee on climate change and strategic, who's the climate change and strategic lead at the Ministry of Defence, on what Defence needs to carry out its responsibilities. Sorry, the light is failing here in Wales, and I suddenly realised it's getting a bit dark to read my papers. Richard, over to you.
Madeleine, thank you very much indeed. And you might ask, climate change, why climate change? And most of what we've talked about today has been about cyber. But actually, I was really struck by some of the words that Isabel Hilton said in the first part, and Paul Kilworth, in terms of the synergy and the similarity between climate change and cyber in some parts, and also China's part that it is playing in some of the issues that we need to be aware of in climate change. I was asked what would the priorities be, and of course, in a military sense, the urgent always trumps the important. Not only the Ukraine at the moment is taking up an awful lot of the bandwidth, if you like, of planning and so on in Ukraine, understanding what is happening, that you'd expect the Ministry of Defence to be looking at that very closely. And similarly, the issues around Taiwan are something that are very obviously looked at, and therefore, where does climate change sort of fit into those things? But I would argue that it would be foolhardy to ignore the importance just because the urgent happens to be there. And we need to understand the implications of climate change and the role that defence needs to carry out and what it needs to do in terms of the threats that climate change presents as well. And I think there's lots of synergy with what George Barnes said, about sharing with industry. We need to understand exactly how industry can support us in trying to get after some of the issues around climate change. And this interconnectedness that Rebecca talked about in terms of climate change, cyber, and how climate change affects so much of what we're doing. And I'm using climate change as a very sort of broad brush way. But I think that what I would do is sort of say, what do we need? And most of what we need, I think, is understanding of the situation as it really is, as opposed to just looking at, if you like, the climatic conditions and the threats from weather. That's part of it. And I think I would agree with Rebecca by saying that we will increasingly be called upon to do humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, both abroad with the overseas territories, but also in the UK as well, as there's more flooding or whatever it is that may require parts of the military to help out to try and overcome some of the difficulties that may present themselves. And I just would observe, and actually China's not immune to this, just before Christmas, China had in one particular part a whole year's worth of rain in 2 days. That's unprecedented. And we sometimes talk about a month's worth of rain in 2 days, and it usually causes flooding. To have a whole year's worth in 2 days is unprecedented. And so there are, that is the sort of humanitarian assistance that we in the military would expect to be called to if it was in our own country. But I think that we need to look slightly wider than that. And I think there is a concern about the transition to or away from fossil fuels and towards green energy. And it's been alluded to already today, in as much as it is very clear that China is trying to create as much of a monopoly as they can on the rare earths and the minerals that are used to create the green energy solutions, and that actually we must go, and this was something that Paul Kilworth said earlier, maintaining a plural marketplace. We must go for something whereby it is not, we're not in the hands of China to provide all the refining of cobalt or of lithium, which is more or less where they are at the moment. 80% of solar panels come from China, and therefore we're in hock to them. And we need to be alive to that and alive to what I would call the power brokers of resource. Because ultimately, we may well be exchanging, if you like, the power broker of somebody who creates fossil fuels that we're reliant on, such as Russia and gas, obviously, to a power broker of somebody who creates all our green energy solutions and has the rare earths for that. We need to be alive to that. We need to understand that, and we need to understand the geopolitical and geostrategic implications of that as a military, so that if necessary, we can play our part in making sure that we do get that plurality and we start to build other alternative relationships rather than relying on one source. And it's not just the rare earths, or if you like, that sort of resource. It's also understanding the geopolitical and geostrategic effects of climate change as it does change the world. So you've got the Arctic melting in the summer. Some would say in 15 to 20 years we'll have free-flowing water in the summer, and the fact that Russia has claimed the whole of the Arctic as a Russian sea, and we need to understand the implications of that. What threat does that pose to us? The fact that China has declared itself as an Arctic country, somewhat arbitrarily given its geography, but actually we need to understand what it means by that, and what therefore our response, and some of that response may well be military, needs to look at. But we also need to understand, if you like, the effect on, and it's been mentioned already to a certain extent, the migration, the effect on parts of the world. And whereas I would argue that in time, it may not be happening yet, but in time, those who are eternally displaced as a result of climate change, they're not going to be able to move back to where they came from because the country, the land will not be able to support them. And therefore, unlike those displaced by conflict, who once the conflict is finished, one would hope would move back to their home, there are going to be parts of the world where people move simply because they cannot live there anymore, where the temperatures will be too high. What is the impact of that? Well, we know from our history that areas where one population is forced to move into a geography where there is already a population has the potential to lead to unrest, has the potential to lead to conflict, and it is certainly a very clear recruiting ground for the likes of ISIS and Al-Shabaab and people like that. They're taking advantage of the fact that people are being displaced because of climate change and turning them into foot soldiers, not ideologically, if you like, for ideological reasons, but because they need some money to be able to put food on the table for their families. So we need to understand these sorts of relationships. We also need to understand the relationships that some of the poorer nations in the world actually are those with weak governance and those who are most affected by climate change. And I think we as the military should be asking, what can we do? The Secretary of State, when he was up at COP26, talked about prevent. What can we do to prevent unrest, prevent conflict, where invited, where we are welcome? But how can we build governance and build resilience in countries that are particularly benighted by the fact that climate change has a significant effect on them? So I think all of that suggests that we need to have much greater antenna, much greater understanding of some of these complex environments. Take, for example, food production. There are significant hits to food production in various parts of the world, which is changing both the cost of food, but where we get our food from. Those trade flows we need to understand so that we can protect what we need to protect if it comes to that. And we need to understand where the world's coming from. So I think that what I would say the defense needs is a really clear horizon scanning of the threats that are emanating from climate change being both a threat multiplier in terms of conflict, but more importantly, in terms of geopolitical and geostrategic changes that might take place as a direct result of climate change. Madeleine, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. It's going to be interesting to see, given the smaller proposed military footprint that the UK is planning, how we're going to be able to stretch our personnel to actually cover all of these civil emergencies. That's going to be another interesting juggling act for the Ministry of Defence. Right, we're coming to our last speaker, and I'm aware that we have moved into the time for session 2, but we fortunately have finally got with us Congressman James Langevin of Rhode Island, Commissioner for Global Cyber Solarium Commission. James, it's lovely to see you with us again, and we look forward to hearing from you. James, over to you.
Wonderful, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I've really enjoyed listening to the discussion so far, and looking forward to the Q&A part of the program a little bit later. But as Madeleine mentioned, my name is Jim Langevin, and for nearly 22 years now, I've had the absolute privilege of representing the 2nd Congressional District of Rhode Island in the United States Congress, and had a heavy focus on cybersecurity over the time that I've been in the Congress. So I'd like to begin by thanking the Cityforum for organizing today's important discussion and for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. So in my capacity as a member of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and as the chairman of the Cyber Innovative Technologies and Information Systems Subcommittee on the House Armed Services Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives, I have spent quite a bit of time thinking about security issues facing the United States, the United Kingdom, and our allies, particularly in the digital realm. So the international nature of our, I would say the interconnected nature of our societies and the vulnerabilities of the systems and networks on which they rely present a host of challenges, as we can all appreciate, to the national and to our national and international and economic security. And these can include acts of widespread and highly intrusive espionage, including against critical infrastructure and sensitive military systems, or acts of extortion and sabotage that fall below the traditional threshold of armed conflict, yet nonetheless have a very powerful coercive effect. The nature of cyberspace has traditionally made attribution of these kinds of operations difficult, allowing malicious actors really to operate with a degree of a large degree of anonymity. So it comes as no surprise, therefore, that we have seen our adversaries seek to use these opportunities in the gray zone to threaten, to pressure, manipulate, and to undermine us, which is quite unfortunate. So let's look at where the major threat actors are, looking at China, Russia, and other bad actors. So to begin with, we've seen the People's Republic of China wield its cyber capabilities to support its government's widespread, persistent, and aggressive intelligence enterprise, which has enabled the theft of trillions of dollars of Western technology, trade secrets, and intellectual property, along with the personally identifiable information of hundreds of millions of individuals. Targets in the United States have included owners and operators of critical infrastructure in multiple sectors. The Chinese government also perpetrated the irresponsible and destabilizing hacking campaign targeting tens of thousands of Microsoft Exchange servers last year, and has been known to use criminal hackers to conduct cyber operations on behalf of the state. Now, of course, China is far from alone on this front. We all know that that Russia is perhaps most notorious for tolerating the operations of dangerous cyber criminal groups within its borders, so long as these groups work for the government when called upon to do so. Russia has also used cyber attacks to compromise the critical infrastructure of other nations, therefore also interfere in other nations' elections, and recklessly launch destructive malware attacks with widespread global consequences. Now, of course, other regional cyber powers, such as North Korea and Iran, also present serious threats. Just by way of example, North Korea launched the WannaCry ransomware attack in 2017 and engages in, of course, rampant cybercrime across the world. The Iranian government affiliated hackers have engaged in election interference and ransomware attacks and have repeatedly targeted critical infrastructure in the US and elsewhere. In short, our adversaries repeatedly and persistently use the gray zone of cyber operations in ways that violate expectations of responsible state behavior in cyberspace, and which really disregard the principles of an open, secure, reliable, and interoperable internet for which the US, the UK, and the so going forward, how do we shape behavior in this international open space, if you will? Well, developing an effective response to these threats requires, I believe, multiple lines of effort. Part of the solution requires increasing our capacity to shape international behavior. We must do more, I believe, to persuade China and other countries to adhere to the international commitments and global cyber norms to which they've agreed, and we need to hold them to account when they fail to do so. So, developing the ability to quickly attribute cyber operations, I believe, is key here, as is building a coalition of like-minded allies and partners willing to take action in support of the rules-based international order in cyberspace. At the heart of all of this, of course, is the need for strong and sustained cyber diplomacy. To that end, I believe that the U.S. State Department's creation of a new Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy is a significant step forward. It's something that I have been interested in calling on for a while, because I believe the U.S. has a significant role to play in reinforcing and upholding the global framework of responsible state behavior. And it can also lend considerable support to cyber capacity building efforts around the world, particularly with partners and allies. So the new State Department Bureau will provide the coordination and organizational capacity required to meet that mission. And I certainly look forward to its ultimate enshrinement in law through the passage of the Cyber Diplomacy Act, which is right now pending in Congress, but which I hope to see passed in relatively short order, hopefully over the next several months. But what else to do, and how do we deny the benefits really to our adversaries when they do launch cyber operations? This is a key area. So I wanted to focus on the fact that a second major initiative that the U.S., UK, and our allies, I believe, absolutely must undertake in countering cyber threats in the gray zone is to invest in domestic cybersecurity and cyber resilience. I believe that we have to deny our adversaries the benefits they perceive that they can gain from their current cyber strategies if we want to see changes in their behavior. So here, our governments will have multiple concurrent roles and responsibilities. For starters, I think government can and should be a driving force to reshape the national cyber ecosystem towards better security. Governments are uniquely positioned to, for example, fund and coordinate security testing for critical technologies and to collect, aggregate, and publish statistical data that informs better empirical cyber policymaking and research. I think this is something that is really lacking right now, and that kind of data and analysis can be very enlightening about where to spend, for example, our next cybersecurity dollar, where it's going to have the most bang for our buck. Government purchasing powers, procurement regulations, and standards agencies can also promote cybersecurity advancements across a national digital ecosystem. In the U.S. context, President Biden's executive order last year to improve the nation's cybersecurity, I believe, was a significant step forward in this regard. Think about the SPOM, the software bill of materials that is now going to be a requirement of things to be included of software. So I think government also has a responsibility to promote national cyber resilience. Part of standing up to nation state competitors or adversaries in cyberspace means ensuring that our nations can withstand and recover from cyber attacks that those nations launch to coerce, restrain, or otherwise shape our behavior. So let's look at now working with the private sector. So I want to focus finally the government really must be able to work in coordination with the private sector. After all, it's oftentimes private companies who are on the front lines against nation-state cyber actors. Public-private cybersecurity collaboration, I believe, starts with developing and maintaining cyber planning and exercising capabilities. Cyber campaigns from state-sponsored actors must be met with coordinated defensive campaigns of our own that integrate both public and private sector entities, and we must know how to plan to execute those campaigns in advance. In the US, we created the Joint Cyber Planning Office for this very purpose. It's housed in CISA, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agencies. These collective coordinated responses, I believe, will also require governments to get actionable intelligence into the hands of private sector companies who can actually do something to defend themselves. Also, improving the quality of information circulating between public and private sector entities will be foundational to effective national cyber defense, and creating a joint collaborative environment to operationalize collaborative cybersecurity information sharing and analysis in the U.S. remains one of my top priorities in this legislative session here. It's one of my top legislative priorities that have not yet been enacted, but I hope to see completed and passed this year. Another priority, of course, is identifying the entities that would be able to make the most use of these improved cyber threat analytics. In my view, these entities should be the United States' systemically important critical infrastructure, entities of extremely high consequences, who are the primary targets, the state-sponsored hackers, yet whose level of existing cyber security maturity allows them to operationally collaborate on a high level with government to secure their systems from cyber attacks. So in just kind of wrapping up, I'll just close by saying the challenges faced by the US, the UK, and our allies across the cyber domain are significant, and much work clearly remains to be done. But I believe the path forward requires us to better shape international behavior and deny benefits to nefarious actors. And I'm certainly going to be working until my last day in office to ensure that the United States is well positioned with its allies and the private sector in fulfilling these strategic priorities. So with that, I want to just thank Cityforum again for the opportunity to participate in this important discussion, and I certainly look forward to learning from our other speakers and panelists as we work to meet this common challenge together. Thank you.